Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett. This week we have Max Ghenis joining us, and Max is the president of the UBI Center, which is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to produce open source research that informs a robust policy debate around universal basic income. So Max is joining us this week to discuss the results of some of their recent UBI simulations. Welcome, Max.
Thanks, Alex, for having me in. Really great to be here with you all.
Yeah, so the question I have for you is, so how does simulation of basic income through economic models help us better understand basic income as a policy tool?
Yeah, I think of Andrew Yang's freedom dividend as an example here. That was a pretty complicated policy. So it was $1,000 a month to adults, adult citizens, funded by largely a value-added tax, but also a carbon tax, a financial transaction tax, raised capital gains rates, raised payroll tax, and it affected benefits as well in some way. So people, especially on the benefit side, really latched onto that and said this was a way to gut the welfare state. And a lot of people either implied or said explicitly that it would increase poverty and inequality. So that was one of our first areas of research, was just simulating what actually would happen, who would come out ahead, who would come out behind. And we found it would reduce poverty by double-digit percentages. Actually, almost nobody at the bottom end would come out because of the benefit reductions. It was, to the extent that people came out behind, it was really because maybe they weren't a citizen and they weren't eligible for that reason. So, which is itself, I think, an interesting policy lesson. If you want to avoid people coming out behind, maybe we should ensure that UBI includes citizens, or I'll talk a bit about kids today too. So I think there are some people who believe we shouldn't necessarily be tying to UBI to taxes. That's kind of an interesting discussion on its own, but people are going to present models of UBI that involve tax and benefit reform. And it's such a costly program that I think it does require thinking of it in a holistic sense, which means how do you design it best to fulfill different societal goals.
And did you start your research at the UBI Center kind of in response to the Andrew Yang plan and the criticism to it, or is that something you were you already working on UBI and you kind of pivoted to that?
It was fortunate. I was already working on it when Yang. So yeah, I spent most of my career in technology. I was a data scientist, and I just had this idea that like UBI is interesting. I think once you get down to the rabbit hole of cash transfers really improve a bunch of other kind of program or outcomes, it's not that far from that to UBI. So I left my job there in 2018, and I guess Andrew Yang had kicked off his campaign by then, but really my goal was a little bit broader, just to understand in general, how do you fund a UBI? How should it interact with the benefit system? So it's kind of fortunate that he introduced it at that time.
Awesome, yeah. And is gutting the welfare state necessarily a bad thing? So, I think there are a lot of people who are, who feel that the welfare state as it is kind of a kludge or a kludge that's put together to kind of cover up these, or as a band-aid over these problems that we have in our economy, that kind of thing.
UBI is the welfare state too. So if you're quadrupling the size of the welfare state or more, I don't see how you can call that gutting it. So I really like what Scott
that's a fair point
about this, about it's basically upgrading the welfare state.
Yeah, I like to say that the economy is a giant welfare program in and of itself. And if you have basic income, then it helps the economy run properly.
Exactly. Wages are welfare in some way.
Yeah. So why don't we get into some of the latest stuff you've been doing? What's exciting? What have you discovered lately?
Yeah, we've been working on a few different areas. I I could present my screen, but I'll just give a brief overview first. What I was hoping to go through with you all. And we actually have a brand new product that we're going to launch on this very medium. So yeah, one thing we've been working on is child allowances. This is really hot in the news, of course, with the child tax credit refundability. So that's actually, if you go to our website, ubicenter.org, the latest analysis, or I guess second latest as of like 5 minutes ago. But I think that's a really promising step. It is a little bit concerning that it's going through the IRS and they might not be able to reach the poorest people who are newly eligible. It really, in theory, a child allowance could alleviate deep child poverty by half, child poverty by 40%, but you need to have a system that can actually reach them. And I think the universality can actually get there. So programs like that go through the Social Security Administration instead. So yeah, we're starting to look at how that could work in California. And also, we just put out a couple new tools. So, well, we have a tool from the Andrew Yang plan from a year or two ago, and we just put out what's called the Basic Income Builder, which is a tool that lets you design a UBI policy with a few different levers. So you have tax levers, benefit levers, and you can decide who is eligible for the program or not, and also do it by different states. So, in general, some of our findings are that UBI is a really effective way of reducing poverty. I mean, you can do means-tested programs, and those will be more cost-effective toward poverty, but they introduce really severe marginal tax rates. So a common kind of proposal is a negative income tax from Milton Friedman that phases out at 50%, which means you might be guaranteed $10,000 a year, and then if you earn $10,000, maybe you'll get only $5,000 from the benefit program. And we don't have a 50% marginal tax rate even on the richest people in the country. So I think we're trying to assess things from multiple angles, not just poverty inequality, but also having an actually at least progressive taxation system. If not, we really have a regressive system at the bottom because of these benefit programs. So
yeah, and it's interesting with basic income, because if you have if you think of basic income as kind of like the default world, then the absence of basic income is equivalent to a head tax, which is
yes.
an incredibly regressive tax. So sometimes I don't think this is realistic politically, but sometimes I say, like, if you want to make the benefits of basic income obvious, if you're like trying to implement it at a local level or a state level, then just implement the basic income and the corresponding head tax, make it explicit how much you're taxing poor people. And then that'll change people's calculations when they're thinking about it.
At some point, I reformulated our logo to be the negative head tax center instead of UBI Center.
Oh, that's great. For like April Fool's Day or something.
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
Cool. Is it okay if I share a couple of our graphs and stuff?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Let's see how this looks. Okay. So I guess we have updated. Can you see my screen? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we've updated our mission recently to be a bit bolder. So our goal is really to make UBI the world's most thoroughly researched economic policy. It's, I think, an incredibly powerful idea that has a lot of open questions. So that's really what we're going for, is answering it from multiple angles: macroeconomics, more just static distributional analysis, poverty, work incentives, all those kinds of things. Even we're starting to work on a tool that will let you review different polls on UBI. So what is the sentiment from different demographic groups, different phrasings of questions. So we're really trying to analyze it from all angles. I mentioned, I guess we talked about this a bit. We did start with Andrew Yang's freedom dividend. So yeah, I think a lot of people were legitimately surprised that anything that touches the benefit system could double the disposable income of the bottom income decile. That is a huge impact, and really kind of an indictment of the existing welfare state, that it can be that ungenerous, that just giving people money makes that big a difference. But it's what the data says. We also did an analysis of Andrew Ng's New York plan, so found that that would reduce deep poverty by about 60% if you measure it appropriately, which is a whole thing unto itself, but you can see that on our website.
And I should point out here that everything you guys do is open source. So if you're like, I don't believe these numbers, you can go on the UBI Center and actually on your GitHub and stuff, and you can look at everything you're doing and all of the like models and tools that you're running. Actually, you know, there is a framework you were using a while ago. I don't know if you still are. You had like this overlapping generations model in Python, and you know, I kind of went in there, and it was you know, I personally was not. I didn't feel like that model was going to get you the right answers to the questions you were asking, but you can actually go in there and decide for yourself whether you want to trust this stuff.
Yeah, it was really instrumental in me being able to get into the field, because normally if you want to do this kind of economic policy analysis, you have to be part of a think tank or government or something, because there aren't really, until recently, weren't that many tools for doing tax and benefit analysis. So when I was at my previous job, I wanted to just play around with some of these ideas. And the way I was able to do that was through a group called the Policy Simulation Library, which builds Python packages for working with tax data. So we've continued to be really enthusiastic about open source. Even our website, you can go to github.com/UBI Center/UBICenter.org, and that's literally the code behind our website. So we do absolutely everything unless we're prevented from it from a third party. Some data is not always public, but to the extent possible, we always use open source everything.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah, so a ton of other stuff in between. We've compared UBI to student debt cancellation, looked at how it affects racial wealth gaps. We did analysis of Senator Romney's child allowance plan, which is, I think, closer to a UBI version of a child allowance than the one we have implemented. There have been a few studies externally, so we try to summarize those as well. We basically looked through the actual data of this study from Canada on how cash transfers affect people experiencing homelessness. So that was pretty exciting. I find myself citing that a lot. Looking at also the interaction with the tax system. So if you had a flat income tax compared to a progressive tax, but if you use that extra revenue to fund a UBI, we found that that can be actually very, very progressive. And also, yeah, looking at specific subgroups. So has UBI affect veterans compared to people with disabilities, or women compared to men? Women experience poverty at 17% higher rate compared to men. And once you introduce a UBI, it not only shrinks poverty overall, it actually shrinks it shrinks the gap between the genders, shrinks the gap between the racial groups. So I think there's just all these empirical questions that are left to answer, and we're trying to make strides there. Okay. Oh yeah, sorry. You want?
I was just gonna ask kind of a side question, which is, out of curiosity, if you had done this research on basic income and discovered that it actually didn't solve the problems you were hoping for it to solve, what would you have done?
It's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think there is. I really love what Give Directly is doing, and this is a little bit of an aside, but Give Directly, they're a nonprofit. They give direct cash transfers to people experiencing extreme poverty. And one of the things I've loved that they've been doing recently is benchmarking against other programs. So a randomized controlled trial, one group gets nothing, they're the control group. One group gets maybe a training program or a nutrition program, something that we've been doing for a while. And then some third group gets the cash equivalent of that second program. And so far, they've found that cash outperforms those other programs on almost every relevant metric. But their goal is to identify programs that outperform cash. I think there are probably a lot of programs. If you look at GiveWell, for example, they do charity evaluation, and they find that giving malaria bed nets or other kind of malaria treatments is about 10 times more cost effective than direct cash transfers. So I think some of these public health interventions are really important and shouldn't be crowded out by cash. But things like food stamps, it's just really hard to imagine. It could be true that people just totally underspend or they spend in the wrong ways when it comes to food consumption. And if that were the case, then yeah, maybe we should have a more regulatory approach. But I find it very hard to believe, and indeed the evidence doesn't back up a lot of these programs compared to cash.
So the idea is that there are a lot of different outcomes we want to achieve in our society and our economy. And it's useful to kind of benchmark them all against cash as the baseline. So you're not talking about, when talking about malaria nets, you're talking about a specific outcome of preventing malaria and comparing that to cash. Whereas maybe there are other outcomes where, you have other metrics, and sometimes cash is the best option we can think of or something like that. Is that right?
Yeah, well, I think malaria, cash maybe prevents malaria a bit, but I think it's a little bit broader, and this comes into moral weights and really deep philosophical questions. But basically, how much is the death of a child worth compared to like increasing someone's consumption by double? There's some multiplier there. It's not clear what it is.
Yeah.
But I think under most conservative assumptions that I agree with, at least, say averting the death of a child is more cost effective than what Give Directly is able to do. I still give to Give Directly personally because I think it's important to do these benchmarking experiments. It's important to empower the poor, but I sort of diversify myself across these other areas. But more broadly, I think this comes back to like the Andrew Yang discussion, where the welfare state in any individual program isn't really an outcome in and of itself. It's a tool to affect other outcomes, whether that's poverty or something like that. And yeah, we should see how it actually changes outcomes. And like, it doesn't matter what you call that set of programs that achieves those outcomes. UBI, I think, deserves to be a big part of it, but we should actually measure the outcomes.
So when you think about the ideal outcomes for basic income, are you thinking in terms of, I want to address poverty, or I want basic income to address poverty? Or are you thinking of, basic income is just a way of getting people money, and there are a lot of things we want to achieve, and we want to kind of compare it to, or do you feel like, what's the problem that you feel like basic income solves in the most general sense, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, I'm really curious to your thoughts on this too. I feel like if I had to boil it down to two, it would be poverty and marginal tax rates. And poverty, kind of self-explanatory. I guess, you might have a third in there, which is how much of the welfare state is cash compared to non-cash. But you really cannot eliminate poverty if you don't have something that's universal. I don't personally believe that it's possible to have a means-tested program that will reach the poor, because by definition, or reach all of the poor, because you're going to have these bureaucracies to verify income and all the rest. And studies do back this up as well. Universal programs reach the poor more than means-tested programs do. And then marginal tax rates, yeah, we have the median marginal tax rate for a family with kids around the poverty line is over 50%. That's just the median. There's a bunch of families experiencing marginal tax rates above 80, 90%, even 100%, even without welfare cliffs, which we've mostly removed welfare cliffs, which is great. But still, once you have one means-tested program, it's really easy to have another and another and another, and those stack atop each other. And before you know it, you're really discouraging work in a way that I worry is pretty pernicious for perceptions of the poor. Poor people are responding to incentives the way that we all would, which is, if you're not going to actually take home part of what you earn, especially after travel costs to jobs and childcare costs, why would you take that job? And then it just gets into a vicious circle. So yeah, I think UBI really has the opportunity to bring more transparency into the whole system and improve incentives and actually eliminate poverty.
Okay, and Bethany has her hand up. Go ahead, Bethany.
Yeah, thanks. This is to the point we were raising earlier about how do you kind of compare where the money goes. And I think probably everybody agrees that, there's sort of a limited amount of resources that a government or a donor can use. And so we kind of have to decide kind of how best to use them. I imagine that the decision for a donor, it's very similar to that for government, but it also, obviously, you're probably dealing with like a lot less money. And there may also be differences in the sense that like certain kinds of infrastructure might not exist in another country. So I'm thinking like with malaria nets, it might be that in the United States, you would still want to provide like something like a vaccine directly for free, as opposed to giving people the money and then hoping that they go buy the vaccine. So like, I think there are analogous cases where we would say, well, let's not give like that extra $20 of basic income. Let's actually just like give I don't know how much the vaccine would cost, but like, let's give it for free because we have a public health, reason to incentivize people to get it. Like, we don't want people to make other choices, or maybe the infrastructure, in the case of the malaria nets, there might be kind of a return to infrastructure or scale or something where like just giving people an extra $5 from Give Directly doesn't create the infrastructure of like cheap malaria nets in the location the way that funding a malaria net specific program does. So it seems like it does make sense to think about these kinds of trade-offs. I know that you, Alex, and probably me too, would think there's going to be some amount of basic income that you want. But in terms of the level of basic income, I think it's very similar to the kinds of sort of research that or trade-offs that Max is talking about in terms of thinking about where things should go on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, I think, when you're giving people basic income, what you're doing is you're saying, hey, we want to let the market allocate resources. And then, sometimes it's more efficient for the government to allocate resources directly. And then you can have a really complicated debate about where to draw the line between, what resources the government should allocate and what resources the market should allocate and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just add that you see two principles that are probably more general in my vaccine and malaria net example. So one principle is like return to centralized infrastructure being more efficient than having individuals do it themselves. So like with the malaria nets I mentioned, and with vaccines, that might be the case. You want the government to invest in some centralized infrastructure that's just going to be more efficient than the market in certain cases. In certain cases, it's much less efficient. So you have to think about which case you're in. And then the other case is like, most of the time, I think we err towards people making decisions to maximize their own well-being. But in cases of a public goods problem, which vaccines are kind of both, interestingly, like they have a public good component and a selfish component, but they do have a public good component, right? Even if somebody has very little risk of getting sick themselves, let's say they're quite young from coronavirus, there's still a public health benefit to them getting the vaccine. So in certain cases like that, you want to nudge people's behavior in a different direction. And so just giving people money and letting them make their own decisions isn't necessarily going to lead to the outcome that is most socially optimal on the big scale. So I think those are two like general principles you can consider when sort of trying to make these kinds of trade-offs.
Yeah, externalities, basically you need to account for those. And actually, part of why I think a carbon dividend is a great potential policy to move toward UBI, because it both addresses externalities and gives people cash. On both the BedNet side and the vaccine side, I think some of the work that GiveWell does to evaluate those programs is really interesting. One of the things they look at is how much room for funding do these other programs have. And for Give Directly, they basically say it's unlimited, right? You can basically double or really increase consumption of the extreme poor to virtually unlimited levels by giving direct cash. Whereas against Malaria Foundation or something like that, they might not be able to absorb $1 billion productively because it just gets harder and harder to find people where the bed nets are easy to distribute them, and it's really high risk for malaria. So I think that's another area, to the extent that there is a benchmarking problem to assess and quantify. That's a really dynamic problem. It's going to change every year based on different circumstances, obviously with the pandemic being a good example.
Yeah, that's an important point. Once everyone has bed nets, you're done. Once everyone has money, you can give them more money.
Yep.
Go ahead, Bethany.
Oh, I agree basically with both of you. Just a few small points. I guess there's always difficulty in we came up with this before, in reaching people, even probably for Give Directly, they have trouble reaching some people. And then I guess the other analog would be like diminishing marginal returns to money with respect to well-being, which is probably like the underlying thing people really care about. But I doubt that's highly relevant here because we're dealing with people who are like starting at such a low level that I doubt you would hit much of like something that looks like you never really reach a plateau. It's just diminishing returns, but you're not reaching that very quickly when you're giving to people who make so little in the first place. So I don't think that's really more of an academic point than like a practical point, I guess. But if you were trying to give like a whole bunch of money to Jeff Bezos or something, you're probably not gonna like make him that much happier until you've given him several more billion or something like that.
That'll be a rich globe by the time we're giving UCTs to Jeff Bezos.
Yeah, exactly.
So here's a question, which is I guess I asked what outcomes do we want to see from basic income, but what do we want to see out of the economy? And we talked a little bit about work incentives and welfare cliffs and stuff like that. What does a kind of firing on all cylinders, maximally prosperous economy look like to you, Max? And how does basic income fit into that?
I think it's one where people are, rewarded for their work, where there's opportunity to invest and reap the rewards of those investments, and where externalities are fully internalized. And so you can't just pollute. There are various ways that this materializes, but I feel like those three pieces will lead to pretty strong economic growth. I think macro, the monetary system is important too. I'm not as expert in that, but so I'm curious what you think there. Or I sort of know part of what you think, but
yeah. So I certainly I agree with most of what you just said there. We want to get incentives right in the economy so that people are contributing the right amount of labor and the right kinds of labor to get the economic output that we want, and we want people to have maximum access to that potential output as well. In terms of the macro stuff, I tend to think about the economy is this giant welfare machine already, and if it's working properly, then nobody falls through the cracks, right? You have kind of a basic income that's kind of the normal way that people get their money, and then the only purpose of the labor market really is to provide an incentive for people to spend their time doing something different than what they would otherwise be doing, right? Because a lot of the work that people do is not paid work. A lot of the important ways that people spend their time and the things they put effort into are not you don't need to pay them to do that. They do it based on cultural incentives or social incentives, or even something they've internalized so that it feels like intrinsic motivation or something like that. But then there's some stuff that we need done that isn't going to get done if you just rely on that stuff. So that's why we have a market for labor. I think if you are paying people wages for a reason other than providing an incentive to do the work, then you're distorting the labor market away from efficiency. So if you're using the labor market, if you're using jobs and wages as a tool for pushing money to consumers, then that's implying that you're forcing people to work as an excuse to pay them. And once you're doing that, you can just hand them the money instead. And that's what basic income is. And it's not just the labor market either. When I'm thinking, big picture monetary system, we stimulate the financial sector to create jobs and to reduce unemployment, right? And so you're not only distorting the labor market away from efficiency, but you're distorting the financial sector away from efficiency. And that creates instability, buildup of private credit, and then you have your financial crises and all of that, all because we're trying to prop up consumers indirectly through the financial sector and the labor market. If you hand people money directly, you don't have to worry about that anymore. So I think we have these kinds of this idea that the economy is a certain thing. Some people are going to fall through the cracks, and you need like a safety net underneath it or something like that, a social safety net. And a lot of people, when they're thinking about basic income, they kind of they're comparing it to the safety net, and they're saying, oh, is it a more efficient form of safety net or something like that? Well, maybe not. Maybe it's actually more infrastructure. It's more, this is a mechanism for getting people, a normal mechanism for people getting their money. And if the way we get people their money isn't broken, then people maybe aren't going to fall through the cracks onto the safety net, right? So it's kind of, it feels like it occupies a different space for me. And I find it interesting that it's often compared to, well, how does it stack up against, means tested programs? How does it stack up against, conditional government benefits and, all of these other things? Or, how does it stack up against, minimum wage, which of course is another example of, pushing money to people through the labor market and kind of distorting the labor market. So I wonder if we can get to a point where the conversation around basic income is more about, well, how does a properly functioning economy work? Because I think it's a lot simpler. If you have a basic income, that's, handing people money directly is a very simple thing, and it's easy for people to understand. It's hard to understand basic income because we're comparing it to a status quo that's very complicated, and you have to go through like those complicated steps to get to the, the simple world with basic income. So that's kind of my little rant there.
Yeah, and to extend the last part of your rant, it's a big part of what we want to do is build a whole simulation of all the benefit systems today, because as you said, you can't understand UBI. Well, depending on the design, I think you really do need to understand the rest of the system to understand UBI. Even though UBI is so simple, it's a transition that's interesting and kind of hard to grok. But I guess, it sounds like you're skeptical of whether people will actually use their labor in productive ways if the market is the incentive machine. And that's where I feel like the internalizing externalities, if people, because we don't have UBI, they're forced to, be a coal miner or something where probably the social benefit is negative because of pollution. I don't know. Does internalizing the externalities address that?
Yeah, of course. If you make it so that the market incentives are aligned with the outcomes that you want, then that's always going to be good, right? And basic income, of course, on its own does a little bit of that by, putting money in the hands of consumers. I think it was Elizabeth Warren during the campaign. She said, the economy only works for the people who have money, but if there's a basic income, then that's everyone, and the businesses are going to be competing for the business of all of the consumers. So certainly that's maybe less of an internalizing externalities thing, but it's also an example of kind of getting the incentives, the market incentives aligned and the prices aligned with what's good for the people.
Yeah. And then I guess the only thing we agree pretty much on all of that. I think the consumption of society is ultimately what we care about. What I am a little bit concerned about is if we only optimize for current consumption, people who are on the planet today, we're going to get a different result compared to if we also incorporate future generations. And that's where economic growth matters. I think it's important to have a system where the medical researcher who maybe could cure cancer for the next, and people don't actually reap the benefit of that until 30, 40 years from now. GDP is going to, it's not the perfect measure, but if the incentives are aligned correctly, it will get us to those spots better in the future where people are benefiting.
Yeah, economic growth in terms of increasing benefit for the people over time as we build more capacity, but also resource conservation when we're thinking about the future. And you mentioned carbon tax, and that's an important example of that. I think when you have something like a basic income, it makes it a lot easier to say, hey, we can all get by with a little bit less, because then you're not just like pushing people at the bottom in the bottom all the way, down to destitution or something like that. So it really allows us to kind of hold back on our resource usage, but also use our resources more efficiently so that we get kind of more from less. We get more output for our inputs. So I think, I don't, I am a big believer in markets. I think, and I'm a big believer in getting markets to do the things that you want by, internalizing externalities and getting the incentives right and stuff like that. I think there are always going to be some things that it's more efficient for the government to provide, like infrastructure and all of that. So it's a matter of getting the market to in kind of a healthy state, so that it can really do what it does the best that it can do it, and also recognizing when it's appropriate for governments to allocate resources.
Totally agree. Yeah.
Bethany?
Yeah, I was just thinking about your point about how it might be easier with a basic income to be willing to conserve resources, and I just wanted to sort of emphasize along with you that right now some of the changes that we have to make are very I don't know quite the word I'm looking for, the opposite of smooth, like choppy or inconsistent in their impact. So like, for example, there's often like people losing, well, even during the pandemic, which is not what you're talking about, but people like lose their jobs entirely or not often, right? As sort of a baseline. And so some people get zero income and some people kept all their income. And so you had like high savings rates and some people, and then like no people, whatever. And so my point is that in general, like you see these effects where certain people are completely screwed as opposed to like a small impact distributed across people, which is obviously tends to have less of a total negative impact on well-being. So I think that's, just to back you up, that's one reason that it would be easier to maybe accept that. I think another reason it might be is that you might get cultural shifts and economic shifts that led to people having more free time, and sort of you might get cultural shifts into investing people's energies into forms of well-being that don't use as many resources. This is more speculative, I don't know, but you could imagine that like with a sense that people have time to invest in a range of different options for well-being, that like people might not hold on as hard to like any particular, I don't know, material good or other thing that they feel makes them happy. Maybe that's not true, but I could imagine certain cultural shifts making it easier too. And I guess maybe more backed up by what we've seen so far is just the general idea that people who aren't worried about their survival day to day are of course more likely to get invested in like social causes in general. So conservation being one possible social cause, although I guess anti-conservation is another one, but hopefully they would go towards the former. Yeah, I don't know if those 3 points made sense. They're a little big, but.
There actually are some studies of cash transfers in developing countries, I guess, moving people toward cleaner fuels and less deforestation, for example. So although it's not always directionally the same way, sometimes they just consume more, which, that's improving their livelihood too. But I think it's less negative than people who maybe oppose immigration on climate grounds would suggest. Kind of like obesity, there are also some differing effects of cash transfers on obesity for children. Some studies find it's positive, some negative. But that's a good one where probably just ending the corn subsidies would help a lot. So
I'd be surprised if it were in the United States if it didn't have a decrease in an effect in decreasing obesity, just because of wealth and obesity being negatively correlated.
Actually, yeah, I was describing there are some in the US that find.
Oh, really? That's surprising.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Huh.
But also some in the US that find decreasing obesity.
I guess all I would add there then, and I wouldn't have predicted that, so obviously this is very post hoc, but like one thing that we've talked about a lot on here is that you have kind of short-term and long-term impacts of a policy. And it's possible, I don't know, that you have a kind of eating can be a very culturally instantiated thing, and you might have a certain eating culture that's related to wealth, and like just adding more money on the short term could just increase the amount of the same foods that you're eating, but like raising your socioeconomic status in the long term might change the whole culture of eating. And so that might be part of what's happening, is that, like if I'm already used to eating a certain way and then you just give me more money, like I'll just eat more of that way. But like, over time I might have resources or whatever it is that makes wealthier people eat differently, that would start to apply to me over time as I become a wealthier person for decades and pass that on to my kids. And so that would be my guess, but I don't know, I'm clearly speculating here, but there, I think the overall point is that and this relates to your question of sort of how to do research on these things, is like their short-term impacts don't always translate into long-term impacts if culture or something else is going to adjust in response. So I guess that's something maybe to throw back at you. Like, how do you think about that aspect of things when you're doing the research or trying to interpret results? Does that question make sense? Like if if you were to implement something for the long term,
Yeah, I mean, I think looking at it's not really what we do. We do more policy simulation and sort of rely on other researchers to do the empirical work. But something we've seen is, even though I love your dichotomy of like the short term and long term, because there's no study that doesn't find that cash transfers improve child outcomes by the time they're grown, and even in teenagehood or something like that. I just saw one earlier today of $1,000 extra income in the first year of life among infants increases income by like late 20s by about 4%. So that's like, you're just starting out in your career, it's only $1,000. And so I think it's just really important to think of the long term. And then also there are a lot of things that go generation to generation. Once you grow up not in poverty as much as you're a parent, you're going to internalize some of those. This is a bit speculative, but I think there have been some studies that show that parenting is also affected by child poverty.
I'm curious, Max, have you done any work on universal health care and maybe compared and contrasted that with universal basic income? Because it's always struck me as a little bit strange that the politics surrounding these two different policies are different. Like, there are some people who are very strongly universal health care, but also anti-basic income. And then the question is, with universal health care, why do you want to force people to depend on an employer for their their health or their health care? And you could ask the same question, like, why do you want to force people to depend on an employer for their income? And I guess the straightforward answer is, because that's what gives them an incentive to do the work. But then it doesn't answer the question of why you're going beyond like paying people just enough to get them to do their work, and then having universal basic income for everything else.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that Yang got a lot of heat for like slightly cutting back on a couple of means tested benefit programs, but Medicare for All eliminates Medicaid entirely, right? It eliminates ACA subsidies, it eliminates CHIP, and people never really pushed back on that. So I don't really understand why the framing is so different. But so we haven't done that analysis directly. But one area where we've touched on it, at least in a paper, is in the UK. We're starting to do more work in the UK. And there have been some op-ed writers who've said UBI could be this generation's NHS. And NHS started after World War II. They were in a really awful time, and they wanted some more social fabric. And now, coming back from the pandemic, this could be something similar. And if you look at the polling around NHS, it's really positive, including just for people really love the universal element of it. They don't ever really want to just make it for the poor, or at least exempt the rich or anything like that. So yeah, I think drawing this connection is really important. Would it be okay if I just showed a couple of our other results?
Yeah.
Last few minutes. I'm just going to jump straight to, I guess, a couple things here. Yeah, I'll skip over the AB 65. I think there was a bill in California that isn't really a UBI. It actually had a cliff at 200% of the median per capita income of the county. So this was like not, I think there was a lot of room for improvement with designing this bill, but it died a couple months ago, so maybe it's not super relevant. But what we're looking now is a child allowance in California. I think this actually solves some of the political economy issues with UBI, because it makes it so much easier for a local area. Really, any local area can introduce a child allowance. It's not prohibitively expensive. So, I live in a city of 200,000 people. If we wanted an infant allowance, let's say $100 a month for every child under age 2, that's no longer means tested. It's going to have huge impacts on long-term outcomes, and it's only going to cost like a couple million a year. We can definitely fit that in. So we can start doing this everywhere across the country, either by lowering the amount or having us lowering the age threshold. So I don't know. I think this is something we're going to be working on more. And also, even in California, we're on the more progressive side for sure when it comes to benefits, but our 2 biggest tax credit programs give $0 to people with 0 income. We give a certain amount for kids under age 6, and then our EITC match also, of course, gives nothing. So there's a real opportunity to ease deep poverty here. So yeah, here's kind of the crux. If we had in California an infant allowance, that would cost about $1 billion a year. This is $100 per month per infant, and that would cut poverty among infants by about 6%. So if you look then at a young child allowance, that's about $3 billion. Now we're getting into double-digit reductions in poverty, 10% among infants and young children. And I should also say that California had a $70 billion surplus this year. Plus, I think the American Rescue Plan funding may be part of that. But we're kind of flush with cash. So it would be hard to do this on a permanent basis, but $1 billion, we have a $200 billion or $220 billion normal budget. So this is definitely something that could be fit in. And then if you have a full child allowance for all kids, now you're looking at $11 billion and you're cutting child poverty by a quarter.
Yeah, and it's remarkable the impact of some of this stuff. You hear some people talk about, basic income is not worth doing unless it's above a certain minimum amount or something like that. Like it's an insult if you only give people a small amount of money, but the impact is huge. Those first dollars are the ones that have the most impact. So it's a little bit, I guess, confusing to me about why people would push back against that.
I agree with you. Yeah. And it's because so much of our system just fails to reach the very poor. There's a whole bunch of people in California who basically get nothing from the government. So we're building these tools for local knowledge. This is a map we're going to publish soon, interactive, where you can zoom in on your legislative district. So every assembly member, state senator can know what the impact of these policies would be. So we're really trying to build technology into this. We've also, this is a bit separate, but we did an analysis comparing childcare subsidies to child allowances. And one of the things we see here is, I guess just focusing on in here, richer parents spend a lot more on childcare than poorer parents. So if you use the money you would use for childcare and you spread it out across everyone as a child allowance, you actually roughly triple the poverty impact. So I think this is one of those areas too where there may be other benefits of childcare, although frankly, the evidence is actually a lot more favorable in terms of child development for child allowances compared to childcare subsidies. I would feel differently if the evidence showed differently, but just in terms of pure who would benefit from a policy like this, it's pretty clear that giving it to everyone is superior.
And when you had that, the other chart of the poverty reduction percentages of the child allowance in California, what is that comparing it to? Is it comparing to just not spending the money, or is it comparing it to spending the money in some other way towards poverty reduction?
Usually we do tax funded or a benchmark to other programs. We left this as just kind of printing money because at the $1 billion range, this is, might crowd out some infrastructure program or something like that, but it's able to be just inserted.
I see.
But we definitely see almost the same results. For example, a lot of our analyses put in a flat income tax as a way to fund programs, just an extra bump to every rate, and you see basically the same results on poverty.
Cool. Bethany, did you have a comment or question?
Only a very small one, which is you were talking about why people don't realize that like a very small amount of money has a big impact. And I was just going to speculate that probably most of the people weighing in on this just wouldn't have wouldn't respond very much to such a small amount of money themselves. And so it's probably just a lack of information about how that could possibly, like what it means to be that poor and how that could possibly make that much of a difference. Just sort of a failure of imagination, I'm guessing, is part of it.
Yeah, I think the pandemic may have changed these dynamics to some degree with more people being on at least unemployment benefits. But I think most people don't really know anyone personally or closely who uses some of the programs that are really meant for really low income people.
And unemployment is relative to your income. So if you're a higher income person, then like that still is a lot of money, right? Relative to us.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think some more storytelling here. There's actually an amazing movie in the UK called I, Daniel Blake. Have any of you seen it or heard of it?
I've heard of it. People keep telling me to watch it.
It is so good. I mean, even if you weren't a welfare wonk like we are, it basically tracks the story. It's fictional, but someone who has a heart attack, he's in his 50s or 60s or something, so can't do his job, but tries to work with the government on qualifying for all the benefit programs. And it's a huge mess, and it shows the actual experience of someone going to food banks. I'm not aware of any artwork like that in the US that captures it. I think it would be a huge ROI for someone in the UBI space.
Well, yeah. I think Richard was the one who recommended that to me. I don't think he's on the discussion anymore, but he was here a minute ago. Yeah. So what's next for you guys at the UBI Center?
Yeah, I think this is one of the things, this is the last thing I'll show before I talk about other things that are next on our radar. We just pushed this today, like a couple hours ago. It's called the Basic Income Builder. So it lets you basically do a few things. You can add an income tax, you can repeal certain benefits, you can limit eligibility, and it'll tell you how much does that fund in terms of UBI if you want to build a budget neutral UBI plan. So for example, if we just have a 5% flat income tax shared across everyone, that will raise 550 billion, 140 a month. About 2/3 of people will be better off, and that reduces poverty by about 1/3. So,
and this is without factoring in macroeconomic effects, right?
Yeah, this is all static.
Okay. And how does it how does this tool compare to something like Conrad Shaw's UBI calculator?
Yeah, I think Conrad's, you have to kind of work with him to design the policy. I don't think you can design a policy on the fly. But his right now has some more features. So I would love to get to parity with that. I think we're using, our data is a little bit different. So our poverty definitions use the supplemental poverty measure, for example, which is a little bit more standard.
Okay, and Blair is asking in the chat how to access the tool. Is it just on the UBI Center website? If we went there now, we'd see it?
Should be, yeah, let's see. Yeah, introducing Basic Income Builder. So it's also bib.ubicenter.org. I don't know why this isn't working. Let's see.
Maybe it's so recent that your DNS hasn't updated yet.
Yeah, it's worked for other people. So this might just be something with me.
Okay.
But yeah, it's for sure right here. So yeah, we're looking to do more of this. For example, this doesn't have marginal tax rates. It doesn't have, there's a whole bunch of stuff it doesn't have in terms of benefit reform and tax reform that could be more nuanced than just adding income tax. But basically, if you have a 5%, even if you repeal all these benefits, we can just see this. It's going to take a minute. So the UBI goes up, and still the poverty rate falls, not as much as if you just have the income tax. But I don't think a lot of people would expect that a 5% income tax would much more than compensate for basically all the benefit programs we have, and especially like child poverty, adult poverty, basically affects every demographic group positively.
Very cool. And I look forward to seeing how this evolves as you add features to it as well.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so a couple other things we're working on, and just to wrap it up, a carbon dividend, we're starting to work with new data sets that estimate expenditures of consumers. So I think this would be up your alley, actually, Alex. We're building a Python package to work with the consumer expenditure survey. There have been a couple of negative income tax proposals over the years, most recently from the new school, which put out what they call guaranteed income for the 21st century. So we're doing an analysis of that, benchmarking other policies. So I mentioned the childcare. We did something on unemployment benefits as well, finding that UBI would be more progressive there, probably. Minimum wage, it really does not take very much of a UBI, like less than 20 bucks a month, to outperform a $15 minimum wage in terms of poverty and inequality. So we'll put that out soon. And then we're really trying to make this micro simulation model. We're going to start fundraising for that to really estimate the marginal tax rates. We've done this in the UK, and it's been very powerful with policymakers. So actually, if you are interested in our UK work, we're going to be presenting it at the BN conference in August. And as you mentioned before, Alex, we are fully open source. So feel free to reach out on GitHub or through the email addresses on our website.
All right, fantastic. Thanks for doing all this. I'm always impressed by how much you guys get done. Every time I check, there's something new on there. Are there any
we have an amazing team. A lot of everything I presented basically was with our other researchers. So big credit to them.
Cool. If people want to support you, they can check you out on GitHub and reach out, and you're open. Yeah,
all of our social donation, all that stuff is on ubicenter.org. So
awesome. So any final thoughts you want to leave us with tonight?
I guess I would just say that the deeper I've gotten into understanding how the existing system works over the years, and I think every month my understanding deepens a little bit about the complexity and everything like that. It hasn't actually reduced my enthusiasm at all. If anything, it's enhanced it. I just keep learning about new policies that I think are opportunities for UBI to, even if they're not better than that policy, I think in many cases they would be, just the opacity of the existing system. It's really hard to measure the impacts of that. But so I'm just, a neutral non-advocacy group technically, as the UBI Center. We're trying to be non-partisan and all that stuff. But I think there's so much opportunity to grow this movement more and have a really positive impact.
Yeah, and this podcast is trying not to be a pro-basic income podcast. We want to welcome all perspectives here.
Nice job with that, Alex.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, this is a great discussion. Thanks for coming on, Max. I've actually been looking forward to getting you on here for a while, and I'm pretty lazy, so I need my basic income. And next week, we're actually going to start a series of discussions. We're going to be reading the book Basic Income by Philippe van Parijs and Yannick van der Boort. We're going to be doing that chapter by chapter. So next week is chapter 1, The Instrument of Freedom. So we're going to be talking about that.
Exciting. Well, I'll definitely have to join as an attendee sometime, and appreciate you putting this together.